What if I told you that Ferrari didn't lose pole position in Japan, but rather that they just discovered that their car has a much more serious fault than they thought? Because what Lewis Hamilton's engineers revealed after qualifying in Suzuka is not a simple rhythm problem. It is an internal X-ray that leaves Ferrari in a very worrying position, showing that while the car works in curves, it is completely exposed on the straight. And that changes absolutely everything within the team. What happened in qualifying at Suzuka was not simply another disappointing result for Ferrari, it was the exact moment in which all the doubts that had been dragging on since the beginning of the season were transformed into uncomfortable certainties. Because when you see Lewis Hamilton finish 6th and Charles Leclerc 4th, you can think that they are relatively close, that there is room, that perhaps with a good strategy or small adjustments they can fight higher. But the reality that is, hidden behind those times is much harder to accept within the team. Since Friday there were already clear signs that the SF26 did not quite fit the demands of Suzuka, a circuit that forgives absolutely nothing because it combines extremely high downforce curves with straights where energy efficiency and top speed are decisive, and Ferrari found itself trapped right at that point where you are not strong enough on the straight to compensate, nor dominant enough in the curve to make a difference, leaving itself in a kind of competitive no-man's land that exposes every weakness of the car. But what was really critical was not that feeling on the track, but what happened later when the engineers began to calmly analyze the data, because something appeared that completely changed the reading of the weekend. Hamilton was being faster in several corner areas, showing that the car does have a mechanical and balance base that works, but at the same time he was losing an alarming amount of time on the straights, a difference that not only nullified any advantage but directly condemned the entire lap. And this is what leaves Ferrari touched. Because when a driver is competitive in the corner but cannot translate it into time because of the speed on the straight, the problem stops being one of driving, it stops being one of configuration. And it becomes a structural problem of the car, something much deeper that cannot be fixed with weekend adjustments, and that is exactly what the Hamilton engineers made evident with the internal telemetry. Even in his Q3 attempt, where every detail counts, it was detected that small instabilities caused changes in the energy deployment that made him lose key tenths only in acceleration sections, which shows that Ferrari not only has less performance on the straight, but also that its system is more fragile and less predictable when pushed to the limit, something devastating in qualifying where you need absolute precision. And this is where the blow is even greater. Because within the team there was a feeling that they were closer, that the car could compete if everything went perfect, but the data has completely dismantled that narrative, showing that even when they execute well, even when the driver extracts performance in corners, there is a technical barrier that prevents them from making the definitive leap, and that is what has really impacted Ferrari after Japan. What seemed like a simple difference in performance has become a clear sign that the SF26 has a limit that they cannot overcome right now. And that completely changes the scenario of the season. From that moment on, within Ferrari we were no longer talking about a simple failed classification. We were talking about a problem that changes the team's roadmap, because when Lewis Hamilton's engineers finish crossing all the data, what they find is not just a weakness, but a constant pattern that is repeated in every fastest lap attempt, in every sector, in every direct comparison with their rivals, and that is what really sets off the alarms in Maranello. Because internal analysis leaves no room for optimistic interpretations. Ferrari not only loses time on the straight, it loses it in a systematic, predictable, and, most worrying, inevitable way with the current configuration of the car, since its energy recovery and deployment model is not optimized for qualifying, forcing drivers to compromise key phases of the lap in order to keep the system within its limits, something that in comparison to Mercedes leaves them completely exposed. And this is where the situation becomes critical internally. Because while other teams can activate performance at key moments of the lap, Ferrari is managing limitations, not enhancing strengths, which means that each attempt at improvement is not a step forward, but an attempt to minimize losses, a completely different mentality that reflects that the car is not designed to attack, but to survive in qualifying. This generates a direct consequence within the team. Engineers are beginning to question not only the current performance, but the direction of development of the SF26. Because if the problem is at the base of the energy system and how it interacts with the aerodynamics of the car, then any superficial improvements, ailerons, mechanical adjustments, configuration, are automatically limited by that technical ceiling that they have already identified. And that is the real turning point. Because Ferrari arrives in Japan with the idea of confirming progress, and leaves with the certainty that its concept has restrictions that it had not anticipated at this level, something that forces it to rethink priorities, times and development decisions in the middle of the season, where every race counts and every update must have an immediate impact. In addition, there is an even more delicate effect, and it is the direct impact on the pilot's confidence. Hamilton, who was already in the process of adaptation, now not only has to understand the car, he has to accept that there are areas where he simply cannot extract more performance, and that in a driver of his level completely changes the way of approaching a classification, because it is no longer about looking for the limit, but about managing a structural limitation that you know you cannot overcome. Ferrari, therefore, does not leave Suzuka alone with a discrete result. It comes out with a much harsher reality. The SF26 has a clear ceiling in classification, and worst of all, is that now they have seen it black on white in the data. And when that happens in Formula One, there is no longer room for self-deception. The only thing left to do is decide how deep the change they are willing to make. And this is where all this stops being a specific problem, and becomes a real threat for Ferrari's entire season, because what was discovered in Suzuka does not stay in Japan. It is not something isolated from that circuit. It is a weakness that will travel with them to every track on the calendar, and that is what completely changes the competitive scenario from now on. Because if there is one thing that the current Formula One has made clear, it is that the classification defines a large part of the result on Sunday, and Ferrari, with this structural deficit on the straight, is entering each weekend with a basic disadvantage compared to teams like Mercedes or even McLaren, which can squeeze performance in the key moments of a lap, something that the SF26, right now, simply cannot replicate. This creates a very dangerous domino effect. Because not qualifying at the top means starting in traffic, it means compromising strategy, it means overheating tires, it means losing options before the race even starts. And although Ferrari may have pace in long runs or a certain competitiveness in specific conditions, everything is conditioned by that initial point where they are already losing the battle. And here appears the most painful comparison: Mercedes. Because while Ferrari struggles to understand how to manage its energy without losing performance, Mercedes has built a system that allows it to do exactly the opposite. Maximize each phase of the lap without visible compromises, which explains why they can make such big differences in qualifying, even when in pure pace the distance does not seem so exaggerated. This leaves Ferrari in an awkward position. Because they are no longer competing on equal terms, they are reacting, they are trying to close a gap that is not superficial. And that implies that any improvement that comes will have to be much more aggressive, riskier, and possibly later, just at a time in the season where the other teams are also evolving. And there is something even more important: the time factor. Because in Formula One you cannot stop to redesign concepts without paying a price in the championship. And Ferrari right now is at that point where it must decide whether to continue developing on a limited basis or if it assumes the cost of a more profound change that could mortgage short-term results. That is the real dilemma that Japan leaves behind. It's not just that Ferrari is far away. The thing is that now they know exactly why they are, and that forces them to make decisions that can define their entire season. Because while Mercedes and McLaren optimize, Ferrari is still trying to understand. And in this sport, when you are understanding, others are already winning. Ferrari arrived in Japan looking for answers, and left with something much more uncomfortable: certainties. Because what seemed like a simple difference in performance ended up being an internal revelation that completely changes the reading of their season. Since now they know that it is not a matter of adjusting, it is not a matter of fine-tuning details. It is a matter of the car in its current concept, having limitations that do not allow it to fight on equal terms in classification. And that is the hardest thing to accept. Because when a team like Ferrari, with two drivers like Hamilton and Leclerc, manages to extract performance in corners but is still far away, it means that the problem is not in the execution. It is in the tool. Suzuka didn't just expose the SF26. He undressed him. It showed that while other teams build perfect laps, Ferrari builds conditioned, limited, incomplete laps, where there is always something that doesn't quite fit, something that prevents them from making that definitive leap that separates the real contenders from the aspirants. And now the question is no longer whether they can improve. The question is much deeper. Will Ferrari be able to correct a structural problem in the middle of the season? Or will this discovery in Japan mark the point where once again they fall halfway? Because in Formula One there is something that always happens. When you understand your problem, you also understand how difficult it is to solve it. And Ferrari, after Japan, has already understood everything. Let me know in the comments what you think about all this.